He was head of the oil company called Halliburton between 1995 to 2000. It so happened that when Iraq was destroyed during the first Gulf War and again now during Gulf War II, and the oil industry has now been reinitiated. Who gets the contracts? Halliburton. Who was the CEO of Halliburton? Dick Cheney. Does Dick Cheney receive financial gain from Halliburton? Of course he does. And so the monies basically go directly into their particular pockets. In fact, even when there was an arms embargo with Saddam Hussein, when you had children dying, children having no water, no food, no medication, and so on, Halliburton, of which this psychopath was the CEO of, still enjoyed company contracts with Saddam Hussein. So in other words, they did trade with Saddam Hussein, even though there was an arms embargo on Iraq back then in the from 1992 right up till 2003, before Gulf War II. And of course, as an orchestrator behind global world events, he was a major player. Again, Rumsfeld, we've dealt with him before in the past. I'm not going to deal too much with him, but he in fact happened to be a CEO of a company which was making aspartame. They call him Aspartame Man. You know what aspartame is? I'm sure most of you have drank these water bottles. You know these water bottles you get, sweet water. Now, sweet water, what they do is that they don't use sugar in the sweet water. They use what they call an artificial preservative, or an artificial, they call it a non-nutritive sweetener called aspartame. And aspartame, according to tests and research, has led, in many instances, to loss of eyesight or bad vision. That's why even today, when pilots are flying, and you know on the flights, they give you water bottles to drink, or they sell you water bottles, sweeteners, sweetened water. Pilots and flight manageresses are forbidden by law to drink this kind of water. Why? Because it can lead to impaired concentration. So these kind of negative side effects that can be found even in a basic product like water, artificial sweeteners, can be quite drastic for human consumption. That's why it goes back to the whole concept of what is halal and what is haram. See, because you've got organizations like Sanha and so on that are basically getting their pockets filled up by handing out cheap artificial certificates and determining this is halal or this is haram. But our entire concept of what halal is or what haram is to a certain extent skewed. Halal means something that is free from restriction, something that is good for consumption, not for Muslims, but for non-Muslims as well. And so on. So the kind of ideas that we find in our organizations, we need to rethink and relook at what we basically give to populations. What you eat, what you sleep, what you see, what you view, who you support. Well, this guy was one of the individuals behind Aspartame, and in fact his company, of which he was the CEO, was dishing out aspartame in large numbers to water bottling industries, and of course they were placing it in water, and all of us did drink it. Of course I loved it. I loved the taste, not knowing what the consequences of this are. It's another example of Cheney, and this man here has been in comatose, in a state of coma for the past, 3 years, 4 years? But as you can see them, Butcher of Beirut, he was one of the individuals behind the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, when he led armed Christian phalangists, armed militia, into Israel, allowing them to massacre up to 3,000 Palestinians at a time, with full support and backing by the United States. Question? Do you have a question? Which one? Well, that's basically a pun. This is the Star of David. All of you are familiar with the Star of David. Now, Star of David, there's a history behind it, because that's not the star that Moses used, or the original prophets used. It developed at a particular time. Star of David is something which is adopted by contemporary Jews. This particular one eye, you see the one eye again and again in ancient Egypt, in ancient Egyptian society. I don't have the pictures here, but what they normally do is that there is a pyramid, and inside the pyramid there is the all-seeing one eye. Now, conspiracy theorists have a field day with this. But what the all-seeing one eye did was that, according to some philosophers, it refers to the great architect of the universe, and so they say this refers to God Almighty himself. According to other researchers, they say, no, this is, in a sense, a kind of a pun on actual control. The all-seeing one eye, big brother, looking at you all the time, monitoring the movements of communities and so on. So I think this is basically a pun, which the, or basically a kind of a satire, which the illustrator in this particular context placed it on there for a significant reason. Sorry? Yeah, no, certainly, I saw that as well. It's the same thing. This is the chap Dees illustration, where the David Dees, who is the illustrator here, was basically just trying to illustrate a point, signifying global control. We see you all the time. In fact, you go to town now, Durban, and what do you see? You look up in the skies and you see CCTV cameras everywhere. And one of the examples we were given that this is there to monitor crime. It's quite strangely enough that Durban, recently in a survey, was one of the highest street robberies committed in South Africa were committed in Durban. Street robberies is in Durban. So what's the purpose of the CCTV cameras? What purpose does it effect other than just to view movements of people and individuals? In fact, yesterday, 2 days ago, I was seeing the Daily News. If you look at what happened at the City Hall, again, this was not given as massive coverage as I would like to have seen it, but city officials were found to be assaulting and beating up refugees. In this case, I haven't brought the newspaper article, but just get Daily News of yesterday, where you had a pregnant woman had to be hospitalized because she was beaten up and assaulted by city officials and police. These individuals who were refugees were subject to xenophobia, and so what had happened was that they had set up tents for them to reside in. And after some time, the eThekwini municipality drew away, or they took away their support, and so these people came to protest outside the City Hall. What happened? They were beaten and they were assaulted by city officials, and this lady had to be hospitalized. Just yesterday's Daily News, I picked it up. So these are the kind of people in power that are exploiting, assaulting people, basically engaging in absolute abuse of what's happening around them. So, in conclusion, that's what it is. Politics may not be the oldest profession, but the results are always the same. I mean, just look at that. Look at this. I love this particular picture. I mean, Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center. What do you want to know? What do you want to know specifically about him? What I was basically suggesting in my slide projections was that he was one of the owners of the two tall buildings that were where you had Flight 11 and I think Flight 7, basically this Boeing Airlines going, and one of the other buildings where he was the owner was World Trade Center 7. Now, what I had suggested was that prior to the collapse, at least just a few weeks before the collapse, taken out a massive insurance policy on the World Trade Center, that on the basis, in the event that those buildings are destroyed by any means, then he would be guaranteed with a massive payout. It just so happened that World Trade Center 7, the building 7, which was shaped like a block, at about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of September 11th, after those two main buildings were already demolished in the rubble, there was a comment which was picked up by him on ABC television, where he said something to the effect that with so much of life that's being lost, we might as well just pull it. Let's just pull it. I thought, just pull it. Now, that basically what many people have said, and researchers have stated, that if you look at the collapse of World Trade Center, you see if a building collapses, how does it collapse? It takes time. No, but what I'm saying, it takes time. If it's demolished, it's immediately. Have you seen a demolition? If you saw a demolition at the Kings Park soccer stadium for the 2010 World Cup, building of stadiums, it's immediate collapse. Now, no building in the world can immediately collapse, even with fire. Secondly, there's never been a history in the world where any building has ever collapsed just on the basis of fire. Thirdly, that building, there was no plane that crashed into that particular building, so the issue of its foundations are not questionable. But just suddenly, after about something like 8 or 9 hours, we saw on our TV screens building free falling. No building can free fall like that. And if you take that into account and the comments made by Silverstein about the fact that with so much of loss of life, we thought just let's pull it. What's the implications from that? It's as if it gives the idea, we don't know, but it gives the kind of idea as if it was a kind of a controlled demolition of World Trade Center 7. That's dealt with at length in many books. I mean, something which is also quite remarkable is that when the BBC was talking about the collapse of World Trade Center 7, World Trade Center 7 hadn't fallen yet. Now, if you look at the Wire News, because most of these major news networks get the information via Wire News, and where does Wire News come from? It comes from the establishment. It comes from either intelligence or it comes from, government. For example, you read again and again, government says this, or the Department of Defense says this, or the Department of Trade and Industry says this. So the information is not filtered. It's basically filtered. It just comes through according to what they say. But remarkably, in this particular instance, BBC was playing a clip of the fact that World Trade Center was collapsing. That's what the newsreader had said. And in the background, World Trade Center had not collapsed. 12 minutes before it collapsed, the lady says that World Trade Center 7 had collapsed. Not the tall buildings, the 2 side buildings at about 5 o'clock. So it raises a question that there was some kind of foreknowledge behind the actual collapse of WTC-7. And when you take that into account and take Larry Silverstein's comments into account, it gives the indication as if it was a kind of a controlled demolition. Let's just pull it. So much of life lost. What are you saying when you say pull it? Pull it means it's a term used. You ask any architecture, you ask any builder, it's a term used in controlled demolitions. Pull it. And it fell down as if it was being pulled down, as if it was being demolished, even though the official account says that it collapsed through fire. Now, no building, you ask any engineer in the world, no building in the world has ever collapsed just because of fire. That raises a number of questions. Of course, we're not dealing with 9/11, but there are just so many issues on that point. I mean, you look at the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Why is it that on that day they were never operational? The Federal Emergency Aviation, they were not operational. You know, if a plane's hijacked, the first thing that government does is that the American Defense Command sends out fighter jets to shoot down the plane. Strangely enough, on that day, no fighter jets were sent out. There was no response. When a plane basically has a specific pattern of traveling, this plane was traveling from New York to Los Angeles. So it was going all the way thousands of kilometers into the Central America, into the central United States towards LA, and then it makes an about turn and it comes back. Now, if you are on the ground manning the plane itself, or basically seeing the operational workings of a plane, and you see that the plane goes in a different direction from where it originally went, where its original destination is, then immediately someone on the ground would phone up and say, what's going on? That was never done. Nothing happened. So there are a number of issues that basically will arise in respect of that. We saw that group, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and so on. In 1997, when they drew up their draft plan called Rebuilding America's Defenses Project for the New American Century, they said that most of the initiatives that they wish to basically promulgate or impart in American or introduce in American society would not be possible without the happening of a new Pearl Harbor. So absent a new Pearl Harbor, these particular ideas and views, it would be difficult to introduce it. And when 9/11 happened, what did Bush say? It says, our own Pearl Harbor. So raises a number of questions. Of course, dealing with the implications of what happened on 9/11 is another topic all on its own, and we don't have, I wish I did, but we don't have the time to deal with that at length. But I hope that clears up the issues for what you had requested. In this book by Harun Yahya. Have you heard of Harun Yahya? Must have heard. He's written a book called Matter, the Other Name for Illusion. And he deals with the matrix at length in this particular book on the basis of the ideas and the philosophies that basically come about. What happens here is that in this particular movie, the person in the leading role realizes that he has been living in an imaginary world, in a kind of a glass cover formed by electrical signals which are given to his brain, if you see that. And while he believes that he is a computer programmer, he's actually sleeping in the place shown above. In fact, if you look at the movie, what happens when he gets up, he finds himself in a tank, and there are computer signals and wires basically attached throughout all parts of his body, as if these computers have got control of his brain and they are transmitting images to him. So when he's walking, when he's talking, when he's eating, as we are doing now, he's part of what they call the matrix, but in fact, it's a constructed reality. That's what the movie says. What he's seeing around is a constructed reality. And so what happens is that programs are loaded into his brain and he sees based on the constructed reality. After the computer program is loaded in his brain by the computer, the person who is actually sitting down is in a very different place, or in a chair, or wearing shabby clothes, or sees himself in totally different places. What happens is that he does not want to admit the truth and the impression that what he sees is basically an image. It's not a reality in the true sense of the word. And there's an interesting example, a scene from the movie where a person in the scene knows that his entire life is shown to his brain by a computer program. And so when he's eating beef, juicy beef, he says, I've got the clip here, he says, I know that he holds his beef and he says, I know that the steak doesn't exist. I know when I put it in my mouth, the matrix is telling my